So when you think of the Roaring Twenties, what comes to mind? I bet it's jazz clubs, flapper dresses, and these huge, wild parties, right? And hey, you're not wrong. But that's only half the picture. This was also a decade of deep anxiety, a nation trying to recover from a brutal war and a terrible pandemic, just desperately trying to figure out what was next. So let's dive into this wild decade of contradiction.
This quote right here from presidential candidate Warren G. Harding, it just completely nails the mood of the country back in 1920. After the absolute trauma of World War I and the Spanish flu, Americans were just exhausted. They weren't looking for some big new crusade. They just wanted things to feel normal again. And that's really the central question of the entire decade, isn't it? The world had been totally turned upside down, and there was just no going back to the way things were. You had soldiers coming home to high unemployment, and all these deep-seated problems like racism and anti-immigrant feelings were just bubbling right under the surface, setting the stage for a massive cultural clash. Okay, let's start with the fun stuff, the part of the story that gave the decade its famous name. We're talking about an absolute explosion of new energy, new technology, and a brand new American culture that really did roar to life. So at the heart of this roar was this powerful new economic engine, consumerism. For the very first time, mass production made all these incredible new products, things like cars and radios, available to the average family. And they could pay for them in a totally revolutionary new way, installment plans. You can basically think of it as the birth of the credit card, buy now, pay later. This didn't just change how people shopped. It created this whole culture of debt that would have huge consequences later on. So what was everybody buying? Well, the automobile, for one, giving people this sense of freedom they had never, ever known before. The radio, which created a shared national experience as families all across the country gathered around to listen to the exact same shows and ads. And oh my gosh, movies. Hollywood became a powerhouse, especially when talkies came along. You put all that together with shorter workdays, and suddenly Americans had more leisure time than they knew what to do with.
All of this energy, this excitement, this modernity, it's exactly why we call it the Roaring Twenties. And the perfect soundtrack for this new, fast-paced city life? Jazz, of course. It was born from black musicians down in New Orleans, and its improvisational, energetic spirit was so influential that the decade earned a second nickname, the Jazz Age.
And you simply cannot talk about the Jazz Age without exploring one of the most vibrant and important cultural movements in all of American history, the Harlem Renaissance.
This incredible cultural rebirth was really powered by this huge demographic shift called the Great Migration. Millions of black Americans seeking better jobs and trying to escape the brutal racism of the South moved up to northern cities. This led to this unbelievable concentration of talent and ambition, all in one New York City neighborhood, Harlem, which became the epicenter of a cultural earthquake.
So what exactly was the Harlem Renaissance? Well, it was this incredible flowering of black intellectual and artistic life. I mean, we're talking about brilliant new literature, stunning visual art, groundbreaking music, and a new political consciousness that celebrated black identity and demanded civil rights.
And the people who defined this movement were absolute legends. You had the powerful poetry of Langston Hughes, the groundbreaking novels of Zora Neale Hurston, the sophisticated jazz of Duke Ellington, and the really influential activism of Marcus Garvey, who promoted this message of black pride and nationalism. These voices didn't just define an era, they literally reshaped American culture.
Okay, so we've seen the roar, but for every action, there's a reaction, right? Now let's flip the coin and look at the other side of the story, a powerful and often fearful backlash against all of this modern change. You can really see the core conflict of the 1920s laid out right here. It was a culture war, a battle between two completely different visions for America. On one side, you've got modern urban life, embracing things like jazz, science, and immigration. And on the other, you have traditional rural America, which championed religious fundamentalism, nativism, and a ban on alcohol. These two worlds were absolutely on a collision course. This backlash of fear first blew up as the Red Scare. After the communist revolution over in Russia, this wave of panic about radicals just swept across the United States. This led to the infamous Palmer raids, where the government arrested thousands of suspected communists and anarchists, often with very little regard for their civil liberties. And it's so important to understand that this fear of radicalism was deeply tangled up with a fear of foreigners, a sentiment we call nativism. A really tragic example of this is the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. These two were Italian immigrants and anarchists, and they were executed for a murder that many people believe they did not commit. It's arguable they were condemned more for their background and their beliefs than for any actual evidence. This tide of intolerance actually became law. The Emergency Quota Act and the Immigration Act of 1924 basically slammed the door shut on immigration, especially for people from Asia and from Southern and Eastern Europe. And at the exact same time, the Ku Klux Klan saw this terrifying revival, expanding its hateful agenda across the entire country.
The backlash wasn't just social and political, it was also deeply religious. This period saw the rise of Christian fundamentalism, a movement that pushed for a literal, word-for-word interpretation of the Bible and saw modern scientific ideas as a direct threat to their faith.
And this clash came to a head in one of the most famous trials in U.S. history, the Scopes monkey trial. When a teacher in Tennessee was arrested for teaching evolution, his trial became this national spectacle, a dramatic courtroom showdown between modern science and religious fundamentalism for the soul of America's classroom. And then, oh boy, then there was the great experiment, Prohibition. In 1920, alcohol was banned with the idea of creating a more moral nation. The result, a complete and total catastrophe. People just defied the law, creating a huge black market for illegal booze that was supplied by bootleggers like Al Capone. So instead of reducing crime, Prohibition actually fueled the rise of organized crime. It was a perfect example of how hard it is for the government to legislate morality.
This failure kind of begs the question. With all these culture wars raging, what was the government in Washington, D.C. actually focused on? Well, for the most part, it took a very pro-business, hands-off approach.
So the decade kicked off with President Harding's promise of normalcy, but his administration got bogged down in corruption pretty quickly, most famously with the Teapot Dome scandal. His successor, Calvin Coolidge, believed that the best government was the one that governed least. He was a big fan of laissez-faire, which is basically hands-off economics. The decade then ended on this note of pure idealism, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, a treaty that literally outlawed war. A wonderful idea, but with absolutely no way to enforce it.
So with all this consumerism, conflict, and corruption, how did the artists and thinkers of the time make sense of it all? Well, a lot of them felt deeply alienated, becoming what we now call the lost generation.
This famous phrase just perfectly captures how they felt. Writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald had seen the pointless brutality of World War I. They came back to an America that they found shallow and materialistic, and many of them became expats, choosing to leave the country to find meaning somewhere else, usually in Paris.
And this all brings us to the final and most crucial point. The Roaring Twenties weren't just some chapter in a history book. They were the decade that forged modern America. And so the real question becomes, which of its battles are we still fighting? Think about it. Debates over immigration, the clash between science and religion, the deep divide between urban and rural values. The echoes of the 1920s are all around us, reminding us that, as the saying goes, the past is never really past.